An overwhelming majority of players will primarily just play DPS classes. This statement is just about true for every single game, and especially MMOs. It's very easy for people to end up shying away from support roles, and there's usually a couple reasons for that. Now, is the playstyle simply less fun for people? Obviously, I can't speak for every person that plays the game ever, but in my opinion, I don't think support roles are inherently less fun than DPS roles or anything like that. More often than not, it comes down to an issue with how the roles are designed, and specifically how the game is usually designed as well. I think Final Fantasy XIV is no exception to this. And honestly, if you think about it, this does make some sense. Following standard party conventions, whether or not you're in a light party or full party, half of the entire group will always be DPS jobs. It's simply just by design to have more of them. And in this way, it makes sense that so many players would gravitate towards DPS. The game is simply just designed to have more of them. But at the end of the day, you do still need tanks and healers to fill out a party. And any regular player can notice, at the very least, the drastic differences in roulette queue times between picking a DPS and just picking a healer. In a lot of ways, there is a lot more going on at a baseline for a player selecting a tank role or a healer role compared to a DPS. For many of us, the luxury of picking a DPS is practically just see glowy button, press button, big number, happy. Whereas for tanking and healing, you get to do that, but you also have to manage aggro or just make sure nobody in your party is dying. Mistakes in tanking or mistakes in healing are far more evident in general than mistakes you make as a DPS, and this is understandably very stressful for a lot of players. Tanxiety is a legitimate thing, and I'm sure everyone's at least heard of healer horror stories throughout different MMOs. However, I'm not going to cover these topics in this video. Instead, I'm going to talk about job variety and job identity. In my opinion, most DPS jobs have a far more unique identity than most tanks or healers in the entire game. And I think that's a huge reason so many players simply just play DPS. DPS jobs just kind of, well, tend to have much more variety in how they approach their goal, which is dealing damage. Even with all the job simplification that's occurred in Endwalker, where almost every melee has a raid buff, personal mit, and an almost non-existent emphasis on positionals, Monk still plays pretty distinctly from Reaper, which plays pretty distinctly from Samurai. In my opinion, casters definitely have it the best in this regard. They all cast very differently at a baseline. Black Mage casts a lot, Red Mage casts 50% of the time, and Summoner barely casts at all. Even if 2 of the 3 jobs have a raise and a raid buff, you can still feel the differences in how they need to approach fights, due to their casting gimmicks and limitations. And I think this is healthy. These classes have a lot of variety in how they function, and it appeals to a bunch of different players. Some people, like me, really like dual cast as a gimmick. Other people, also like me, really enjoy just putting a ley line down and just standing still for 30 seconds. It's especially fun when you get to contextualize it in a fight with different mechanics and movement requirements. In raids, you really notice the moments when you have to cast an EI Jutsu as Samurai, and your movement becomes far more limited and far more important during your 1 and 2 minute windows. As much as people have ended up complaining about job simplification and whatnot throughout Endwalker, which I honestly do understand, there's still a lot of differences that many DPS jobs have in particular to stand out from each other. Differing GCD speeds, movement requirements, damage profiles, buff timings, mobility options, and really many other things do allow most jobs to feel distinct from each other despite a lot of the simplification. And this is still totally fine in my opinion. Differences like these are what make jobs feel distinct and unique in Raid, especially if you've played multiple of these jobs at some point in a fight. A raid is a static fight that will be exactly the same for everyone in the group. But differing GCD speeds, cast requirements, movement limitations means that everyone in your group is going to interact with the fight differently based on their job. And this is good and healthy. This is how jobs feel unique from each other. Honestly, before I started raiding, I was getting kind of bored playing my favorite class. I never felt like I needed to really push myself with Samurai. Now, this is largely by design, of course. Normal content is designed to be accessible, and that's totally fine. But when I started to actually play this class in Raid, and having to pay more attention to my dot timings, maintaining my personal buffs, pooling resource for raid buffs, delaying Yaijutsus to allow for movement, pot timings, third eye procs, feeling like my EI Jutsu casts are a commitment, and that I have to work for the damage that I deal. To be honest, it just makes me feel really fucking cool. And sure, yeah, if I put it like that, it's gonna sound stupid, but planning out my entire loop and pooling every resource, landing every third eye proc, and building this perfect 2-minute burst window where every GCD up until that point really does have a purpose, and being able to adapt the cycle to the unique requirements of each fight, oh, it feels good. And I feel so cool when it all comes together. And ultimately, that's the crux of why I still play the class and still raid in this game in general. And really, at the end of the day, that's the beauty of it. What's cool is ultimately subjective, and that's the beauty of class choice. Some players like casting mudras and doing all their inputs and getting their TCG in correctly, and some players like optimizing standing still and knowing exactly where in the fight it's safe for them to cast. For other players, the satisfaction of clearing a raid as a healer is just incomparable to any other role. When I make mistakes with my AI Jutsu casts and die because I have a rough 1 minute in a fight, I sometimes get comments like, oh yeah, that's such a hard 1 minute for Samurai, and then they make a joke about, all Swift cast for Samurai next expansion please. And obviously I know people are just making a joke here, but that's what I love about the class. On a role that's not designed around having cast times and their only movement restriction is maintaining melee range, having to meaningfully sit down for a second and a half and cast my really strong skill has ramifications in raid, and I love that. It's immeasurably satisfying to me when I'm able to pull it off successfully, because I know it's possible, I know it's doable, and I know that I can do it. My journey with the job has been a long one, and to this day I'm still learning and improving with it. That's a big part of the satisfaction for me. Despite however much simplification has happened in Endwalker for various different jobs, there is a remarkable amount of skill to develop regardless, and tons of jobs have a lot of variety and a lot of things to really push and explore. Now again, that's not to say things are perfect or anything by any means, and yes, I would like to have Kai 10 back before anyone asks, but I'm still happy with the class as it is right now, and it's not the only class I feel that way about. Not every job needs to be for everybody. What's fun to one person may not be fun to the next person, and a big part of developing uniqueness and variety is creating meaningful differences between jobs, and embracing them. Feeling the distinction of playing a monk with 1.94 GCD compared to a much slower Reaper at 2.49 is a huge difference, even if the jobs did have similar GCD structure and flow, which they don't. If the fights are unique and require different answers out of different jobs, those jobs will feel distinct even if they have some similarities between them. Obviously, variety could always be better, but most jobs already have enough depth to them to feel rewarding, and almost every job in the entire game has some unique knowledge that's only applicable to that job alone. Many longtime players would argue that a lot of the uniqueness behind jobs has slowly been eroded away, and, well, this is kind of true. And I can't really act like I knew what jobs played like in Heavensward and Stormblood, I just didn't play back then. But many jobs do still feel rewarding and engaging to play, especially when put into raiding environments. And I would encourage people to try and push their comfort zones and play jobs that you don't normally play in raid, and give something different a try on a fight you already know. The experience might be a lot more different than you would expect. However, most of what I've just talked about so far is largely a DPS specific thing. For the most part, tanks and healers honestly just don't have the level of variety that DPS jobs do, and I think that's one of the primary reasons that these roles are seen so much less. Now, of course, there's also far more DPS jobs in the game than tanks and healers combined, but not every single tank plays the exact same, of course, but in a lot of ways, Dark Knight is basically just an OGCD spammy warrior, and with the Paladin rework, In a lot of ways, it's kind of just a simpler version of Gunbreaker without the commitment of having to generate your cartridges. Pair this with how their mitigation styles, the only actual tanking we really do, are all largely very similar at this point. Every tank stacks damage reduction with OGCDs and has basically the same invulns at this point. And you end up with 4 jobs that kind of all feel like the same thing. Now, obviously to say every single tank is the exact same is just simply not correct. But there's a lot of intentionally designed parallels that keep them in line with each other. All tanks revolve around their 1-minute cooldowns and/or general rotation styles. Only Dark Knight and Gunbreaker, for example, even have a 2-minute DPS cooldown. And while each tank does generate and pull resource differently to plan for a 2-minute window compared to a 1-minute, really dumbed down at a baseline, literally every single tank is hitting 1-2-3 in their combo, burning some 60-second cooldown for damage, and spamming the same GCD or button over and over again. Pair this with how mitigation is currently extremely similar in function between all tanks at this point, and you wind up with a role that feels more like 4 flavors of the same job instead of 4 jobs that feel truly unique and distinct. Now, I understand this is a difficult situation to handle as a game designer. I think tanks are a very challenging role to design and implement well, but I know I'm not the only person who has issues with current tank design. In my opinion, tanks are by far the most shallow and one-dimensional role right now, and I think that's kind of a shame considering we need 2 tanks in every 8-person party. I don't think any of the tanks are fundamentally flawed in design or anything, besides potentially Gunbreaker and it trying to be a melee DPS. But even with that in mind, I don't think any of them need major reworks or overhauls to make them feel better and more unique. For example, even if I fully considered Gunbreaker to be a flawed design, it is still easily the most unique tank in the game right now. This is the kind of topic that's really better suited to its own video, I think, but put it simply, I think more tanks need more unique GCDs to differentiate them. Warrior does a phenomenal job of this in my opinion, whereas I think Dark Knight is by far the most shallow when it comes to GCD structure. Making some small changes, like just making Shadowbringer into a GCD ability, would free up a lot of OGCD room for the job and make it feel a lot less clunky. Currently, I think Dark Knight and Gunbreaker as well both have these issues where so much of their damage is pushed onto the off-global cooldown, which is normally fine for roles like DPS, but tanks purely mitigate off the global cooldown as well, so it's not entirely uncommon for you to run into these situations as one of these tanks where you don't have room to mitigate without simply losing damage or drifting one of your cooldowns. I don't think that the solution to this is to take all off-global skills that deal damage away from tanks or anything like that. This only even becomes an issue when you need to mitigate specifically on either a 1 or 2 minute window, and they've tended to kind of avoid that in raids nowadays because of how cluttered some of these tank rotations are. But that being said, putting a bigger emphasis on unique GCD structure would not impede their abilities to mitigate and help them feel distinct regardless. Obviously, this is the kind of thing that is easier said than done, and yes, I am aware that Gunbreaker already has a lot of GCDs, especially for a tank. But I think elaborating on GCD structure for multiple jobs is probably the most effective way to make jobs feel unique and distinct from each other, while maintaining a lot of the same off-global utility skills that are shared between roles. With regards to healers, I think the differences between Sage and Scholar showcase this extremely well. Sage and Scholar are extremely similar to each other in almost every regard in terms of how their heals actually function. And yet, despite this almost literal copy-paste of abilities, playing as both Scholar and Sage feels wildly different from each other, even if their function as a healer is practically the exact same. Sage feels extremely clean and fluid, while Scholar is just pretty much inarguably the clunkiest job in the game right now. The reason behind this, at least in my opinion, is the very unique GCD structure that Sage has in comparison to Scholar's Broil. Sage has by far the most unique and dynamic GCD damage structure of any healer in the game right now. And this very clearly shows managing Toxicon stacks, utilizing Phlegma as an instant cast, being able to apply shields on the move with Eucrasia. You have plenty of resources and cooldowns that change the way you cast and give yourself instant cast windows. Because so much of Sage and Scholar's healing is attached to off-global abilities, Being able to manipulate when you can and can't instant cast gives you freedom to single and double weave heals in ways that Scholar simply cannot do without just losing damage. The end result of this is you wind up with a healer that has the same exact heal cooldowns as another healer, but is far less rigid and strict with when it can apply them optimally. Sage gives you more opportunities to use your abilities. Both Sage and Scholar have so many off-global heals that synergize very well with each other, and Sage has the opportunity to double weave them and combine them without losing damage. Scholar simply cannot do this unless you're refreshing your dot or willing to hit Ruin 2 and lose potency for that. Now granted, hitting Ruin 2 and losing a little bit of potency isn't the end of the world, and that's also not to say that Scholar is incapable of combining its heal cooldowns or anything. It absolutely can if you plan them out GCDs in advance and combine them that way. But simply being able to double weave and combine your skills together in certain weave windows just feels so much more clean. Personally, I would love to see Scholar gaining a Ruin 4 style ability much like its counterpart Summoner. After pressing Aetherflow, they could grant the further Ruin buff much like Summoner, which for the next 60 seconds will enhance their next Ruin 2 to Ruin 4. From there you can make this a potency gain over Broil, so that you're encouraged to use it, and keep it an instant cast as well, so that you gain another instant cast opportunity to double weave your heals, as well as giving you another tool for movement, outside of literally just your DOT. Pure Healer design is much different by comparison to Barrier Healer design right now. Both Astro and White Mage have very unique heal cooldowns and approach healing very differently compared to each other. But honestly, Astro is kind of just a mess to play right now, and it has already been confirmed to be getting a rework next expansion. At the very least for now, both Pure Healers are very unique to each other in function despite sharing some cooldowns. White Mage is rewarded for GCD healing with Lilies, where Astro simply provides damage buffs via cards to compensate for losing damage whenever it has to click Helios. And unlike the Barrier Healers, both White Mage and Astro do have very unique heal skills that differentiate each other. Earthly Star is Astro's defining ability, and no other heal skill in the game is really fully comparable to it. Compared to Sage and Scholar, White Mage and Astro do approach heals very differently, and this is good. One healer revolves around delayed heals that you have to plan out in advance to get the most value out of, while the other incentivizes you to constantly maintain and burn strong GCD heals throughout the fight, so that you can plan around using a very strong GCD damage spell. Both of these jobs are very unique from each other, and I think for the most part are a huge success in job design. The main issue with the two is really just playing cards optimally on a 2-minute is just so clunky and restrictive right now, that most players will simply pick White Mage because it's far easier to play. That being said though, I do think most of Astro's kit when it comes to healing specifically is perfectly fine and very unique. The current design of cards just don't mesh very well in an environment where every single class is bursting on the same 2-minute window. There's just too many cards to play in such a short amount of time. And obviously people who play Astro and play it very well know how to manage this, but for many of us it's just frustrating to deal with. And if you have to pick a Pure Healer, a lot of players are just going to pick White Mage because it's easy and still feels good. Now, as this is a video about job variety, I don't want them to simply make Astro into White Mage too. I do hope they maintain the card system, and I really hope that most of their healing toolkit is more or less exactly the same. But I do think they need to take a look at cards, and I do hope that's the primary focus of the rework, as I do think it would be a shame if we lost an ability like Earthly Star. Honestly, my biggest criticism with Pure Healers, and really both types of healers as a whole right now, is that you only have 2 options for Barrier Healers and 2 options for Pure Healers. Even if the 2 jobs in each role do feel distinct from each other, 2 choices is not that many. It's far fewer than pretty much any other role in the game. There is variety between the job choices themselves, but since we have so few healers in the game, that kind of kills part of the variety. In almost all 8-person parties, you will have either a Sage or Scholar and a White Mage or Astrologian. It's certainly not a hard set rule or anything, but Barrier Healers and Pure Healers are usually mutually exclusive with each other. Which is to say, most content just isn't designed around having a Sage and a Scholar in the party at the same time, even if the jobs do have a deceptively high amount of synergy with each other. Barrier Healers and Pure Healers are both designed to specialize in 2 different things. Barrier healers obviously focus on reducing damage taken by the party with their AoE shields and strong OGCD mit options, while pure healers focus more on actually healing after the damage has come out and quickly raising and recovering players without hurting their mana reserves too much. While all healers are capable of doing both of these things, at least to some extent, splitting them into two distinct roles streamlines the healing experience significantly, making it far easier for those who are new to healing, or those healing in public environments like Party Finder, where you can't really communicate with your co-healer that effectively. And while this has certainly allowed players like me to be able to approach healing and actually be relatively successful with it, in a way this does hurt variety. Whenever I'm healing in a raid, I almost always exclusively play White Mage, and because Sage and Scholar, my only two primary co-healer options, have practically the same exact healing toolkit, I never really have to adjust or significantly change my heal cycle based on what my co-healer is playing. However, by comparison, I know from both Sage and Scholar players that the experience of healing with both a White Mage and Astro is approached very differently, or at the very least, more different than between Sage and Scholar. And I don't really consider this to be either a good or a bad thing, it's just something that I've noticed after healing for a little while in this expansion. Much like tanks, I do think healers are a very difficult role to design well, and I think it's something that a lot of game developers struggle with in pretty much every genre. It's far easier to design a more interesting and unique gameplay loop for a DPS class specifically, because DPS as a role doesn't really tend to interact with the party in the same way that tanks and healers do. And this is largely because of the actual distinction between dealing damage and healing damage. We deal damage to AI enemies that don't react differently based on the damage they take. And we heal players who sometimes act very differently based on the damage they take or the amount they get healed. Removing the human factor is the key distinction here, and it's why it's far easier to design unique DPS classes. Only the player piloting that DPS job really gets the feedback of their rotation. It doesn't matter how much damage you deal to an enemy or how your damage is distributed. It also doesn't really matter how good or bad your Samurai or Black Mage or Red Mage or anyone in your party is. As a DPS player, you are responsible for the damage that you deal, and for the most part, other players have no say in that. Now, you could argue this gets slightly more complicated when you add buffs into it, but even if devilment is misaligned completely, that doesn't change your loop as a samurai directly. It doesn't make your loop impossible at all. You can still play the job the exact same way. And sure, maybe it's not optimal or anything, but it doesn't actively disrupt the flow of gameplay. You are not being forced to do anything differently. By direct comparison, however, both tanks and healers are roles with far more party interaction than DPS classes. The amount of damage that you mitigate as a tank needs to be healed up by another person. And similarly, the amount of health that you heal as a healer is also being applied to other people. And obviously, if you don't heal a player enough, then they will die. And it should go without saying that a death is the most obstructive thing that can happen to your gameplay loop, regardless of your class. And I think this is the primary distinction the human element of managing players' health bars showcases why tanks and healers have been streamlined to the point that they're at now. If each tank still mitigated significantly differently from each other, that pushes the skill floor of healing significantly higher, because not only do you need to know what your class as a healer can do, you need to know how the other tanks complement and possibly conflict with that as well. Similarly, if you remove the distinction between barrier healers and pure healers, it becomes much more ambiguous what each healer is supposed to be doing in a raid. And of course, you can point out that the distinction between barrier healers and pure healers didn't exist before Endwalker. And yeah, that's totally right, that's how the game has been for years and years now. Uncoincidentally, healing has been considered the hardest and most stressful role by just about all players. And yeah, you know, for the players that have been healing for a long time now, the role probably does feel a lot more dumbed down and simple by comparison to how it used to be. But the reason these changes have been made is to streamline the process and make both tanking and healing far more approachable for players. As I said earlier in this video, at the end of the day you need 2 tanks and 2 healers in every 8-person party. If nobody is playing the role because it's too hard or too stressful, then everybody suffers as a result because we just don't have enough players to fill a group. Now, do I personally think that this is a good thing? Well, yes and no. The more that I play, the more that I do wish there was some more variety and distinction in some of these jobs to make them more interesting at a high level. As I mentioned earlier, I do think this is largely an issue with tanks and kind of healers as well, but at the same time I do understand why a lot of these decisions have been made and why so many jobs have been streamlined in some fashion. The goal of these changes, I think, has been to streamline and simplify the learning process for new players and to smooth out the experience for Party Finder players. And I mean, hey, I was a new player not too long ago and I'm still a Party Finder player, so I can't really be too upset at any of these decisions, really. They've all just kind of served to benefit how I play, and they've absolutely helped me to learn and improve at the game. And considering how this has also been by far the most successful expansion in terms of sales and popularity, with so many new players trying the game out and really getting into it, it only makes sense to streamline the roles to simplify the learning process for them. Ultimately, we're just gonna kinda have to wait and see how things play out next expansion, but I don't foresee them shifting away from this design philosophy. It pretty clearly started back in Shadowbringers and has clearly been very successful for them throughout Endwalker. And honestly, even though I understand the criticism and share some of it, I really don't think it's strictly a bad design philosophy either. It's absolutely helped players like me be able to understand the game better at a higher level, and finally be able to jump into Raid and enjoy the content I've been wanting to do for so long. All I can really ask for at this point is that they just maintain this philosophy and build on it in interesting and subtle ways. I do think there's a very solid gameplay foundation available, and it honestly really doesn't require that much nuance for one thing to feel distinct from another. But anyways, at this point I've been talking and rambling for almost 30 minutes about job design and identity in Endwalker. Obviously, this is a topic that many other content creators have already explored over the course of the expansion, but I still felt like it would be worthwhile to give my feedback on things as well. I haven't been around even close to as long as many players who play this game, but that's okay. Newer player experiences are still valid, especially with the amount of new players we've received in the game since Endwalker. And what we do have is a job environment that's honestly pretty accessible and easy to understand and learn at a baseline. Though some jobs have, unfortunately, kind of had their skill ceilings thrown to the wayside, not all of them have, and not every job in the game is this brainless rotation loop that basically just plays itself. I feel like people kind of overfixate on the negatives instead of understanding what we still have available, and what we have is an honestly very accessible combat and raiding system compared to many other MMOs out there right now. Obviously it's not perfect, but it's never going to be, and you're never going to get perfection in any game. And from that, we'll just have to see what comes next. Maybe the next expansion will be a disaster, maybe it'll be a masterpiece. You know, we can't say yet. But at the end of the day, I have confidence in the product that we'll receive because it's very clear that the people who make this game care about their product, and that's something that you don't find in very many live service games anymore. With all of that being said though, if you're starting to feel like the job variety or even the game itself is getting a little bit stale, maybe consider trying something else for a bit. Whether it's a new job, a new role, new types of content, or maybe even just a new game. Nothing is going to be fun to someone forever, and to quote a very old and cliche proverb, variety is the spice of life. Thanks for watching.